So first of all, just to start out the video, I'd like to make a distinction between being a good person and doing a good thing, because I believe there is a difference. For example, you could be a good person but on a whole do bad things. Similarly, you could be a bad person but on a whole do good things. To do this, I want to use one example and an analogy. For my example, I'm going to use a Christian missionary. Now this can be a missionary to anywhere: Africa, China, Australia, America. A Christian missionary from the 19th century going back. Now if you look at these men, they're people with immense, unbelievable moral fortitude. They're people who went out to often completely undiscovered, completely unexplored parts of the world, into jungles, into deserts, into all sorts of hazardous places, literally putting their life on the line from disease, malaria, starvation, often being attacked by the people they came in contact with. As well, it's not just their life, but the general suffering, the general pain, the general anguish, the extreme hardship that they would have endured by doing this. And there was nothing that they had to gain from it. In terms of money, in terms of getting a job. Given the social standing the vast majority of these people were in, they could have got far, far more if they'd stayed in Britain. If they'd got a much safer job, a much easier job. And often on these missionary exploits, they got literally nothing. They got no money. They got a very meagre stipend provided by the mission to feed themselves, which often wasn't enough. But regardless, they did this. They went out, they established schools, they established hospitals, they established all sorts of infrastructure in places where there once was none. Literally put their own lives on the line, not just in terms of death, but in terms of, again, the suffering, the hardship, the unease, if going into a completely unexplored, dangerous part of the world, completely untamed. And he did this from purely altruistic reasons. And yet, if you look at what came of that, at least what came in a lot of circumstances, of course, a lot of good was done, but at the same time, cultures were wiped out, languages were wiped out, entire ethnicities. In many places, the arrival of the missions, the arrival of what came after, caused a complete destabilisation and complete genocide of entire societies. Rather than feeding people, it caused starvation, it caused people to leave their cultures that they'd practiced for thousands of years to become self-reliant on the missions. And then if the missions failed, as they often did, you of course don't hear of the countless that failed. Once they failed, they could have been leaving hundreds, if not thousands of people into starvation. Whereas the original goal, the original intention, was to save lives, was to feed people. They caused the opposite. I think these are the pinnacle, the very highlight of moral people, of good people, putting their literal lives on the line for nothing, for purely altruistic reasons. And yet a lot of bad can come of it. And I think, as much as people recognise that bad, as much as people recognise the wrong that was done, it's important to recognise that these men, as a whole, were the pinnacle of morality. Similarly, if I could use an analogy, you could say that you have a child and a mother. You go into a shop. Now the child, let's say they're 4 years old, they fill their pockets with sweets, they fill their pockets with whatever before they're leaving the shop. And just as they're about to leave, they're discovered. Now keeping in mind that they're 4 years old, they probably don't know the consequences of stealing, they don't know why they shouldn't steal. They're used to living in an environment, living in their house, where they can freely take whatever they want at will. There are no restrictions. And yet in a shop, this is obviously a very different environment. This is another good example of, you could say, a neutral actor doing a bad thing. However, if a few months later, after it had been described to them, after it had been explained, and if they'd fully understood the consequences, both moral and practical, of theft, and they'd stole again, they'd once again filled their pockets. Let's say this time they'd tried to be more discreet than the last, then you have a very different situation. The actual circumstances, what's happening in terms of theft, how much is being stolen, where it's been done, who it's been done by, are all identical. But now you have a different moral, you have a different motive, you have a different intention. You essentially have an intelligent actor, and this makes them a bad person, because now they've been burdened with the knowledge, with the awareness that what they're doing is wrong. And I think what this points out is, it's not necessarily the thing itself that makes someone a bad person. Of course, theft is wrong. Under certain circumstances, you could steal, you could commit other immoral actions, and if not be a neutral actor, in terms of simply being ignorant, you could actually be a good person. And the thing that flips it, the thing that changes it, is this understanding, is this awareness, is the lack of ignorance of realising that theft is wrong. If you want to use the previous example, of course these people couldn't be aware of the consequences of what they did, as they were often good. If they were somehow to become aware of what they were doing would lead to starvation, pain, death, genocide, etc., it would only then become incumbent on them, it would only then be under their responsibility to not do what they were doing, as they would have understood the consequences were once they did not. And again, I just really want to lay down the groundwork that you can be a good person while doing bad things. Now, the second thing that I want to tackle is what does make a good person. Well, again, to take it back to the first example, I think the reason that we can see the missionary as such a good person is because of the suffering they endured, is because of the hardship, the extent that they were willing to throw themselves for altruistic means. Say for example that you had two people, you had a rich man and a poor man. Every single month, the poor man donates £400 to a charity. It can be any charity, it doesn't really matter. And similarly, the rich man donates £400,000. For the rich man, the £400,000 is nothing. It's a drop in the water. However, for the poor man, that £400 a month could easily be a third of what he makes. The sacrifice of £400 is a significant sacrifice. It does cause genuine pain and suffering. It causes economic hardship, uncertainty. It means that he can't have any savings. He may even be in debt, which he can't pay off. However, for the rich man who's say makes several tens or even hundreds of millions, this is hardly a sacrifice. It's nothing. At the end of the day, 400,000 to him is similar to £4 to the poor man. And yet if we actually look at the consequences of what they're both done, 400,000 is 100 times as much as 400. The kind of lives that could save, the kind of good that could do, is significantly higher than £400 a month, especially if it's donated over a large amount of time. That could easily accrue to millions, whether it's 400 could maybe accrue to a few thousand, maybe 5,000 over the course of several years. And yet, if we're looking at the rich man, I think it's very easy to not only not view his intentions as good, but actually see them as bad. In terms of accruing PR, good press, he's making a very small sacrifice, and he could actually gain much from it. Again, in terms of good PR, whether it's the poor man, he isn't in the media, he isn't in the papers, no one's going to recognise him. All of that money that he's donating is purely anonymous, and it does have a massive impact on his life. So despite donating significantly less, he would be the good person in this scenario. Similarly, if you looked at a different scenario, you could say you could have a middle class, wealthy vegan in California, surrounded by a group of people who are also quite socially progressive. And then you can compare that to someone who, say, lives in a small town in Texas, a town of 500 people, who's also vegan. Under one circumstance, going vegan would be incredibly easy. They'd have more than the money to do it. They'd be in an environment, both financially in terms of the kind of shops, the kind of places they could go to get food, would it be easy? They'd be in a kind of social environment, would it be easy? In terms of lack of judgment from friends and family. And then you can compare the man who's doing the exact same action morally, but lives in a small town. For him, simply getting food would be genuinely hard. There is nowhere in that town that has, say, a Walmart or a bigger, more recognisable establishment. Everything in that town is family owned, small. Needless to say, there are no vegan alternatives, there are no soy milk, there is nothing. The best that he could get, if he was lucky, would be bread, vegetables, beans, etc. And because of this, his diet is very likely to be sufficient in nutrients, or sorry, rather deficient. He does cause general suffering to himself, both physically and in terms of the fact that the judgment he would likely face would be far higher. They're both doing the same thing, but it's this distinction of the suffering, of the sacrifice, that makes one person the better person. And again, I think we can see this generally wherever we look. Being a good person is about doing the good thing, the right thing. It's about doing the hard thing, it's about doing the difficult thing. If you're rich, if you make millions, donating a very small amount to charity does not make you a good person. It is very easy to do so. If, however, you're donating a much larger percentage of your income, say 10, 20, 30, 40%, you do become exceptional. Similarly, being vegan in a place where it's easy, well, I do think there's a certain amount of moral courage that you need simply to face your own prejudices. There's a big difference between being vegan in, say, Los Angeles and being vegan in a small, anonymous, no-name town in Texas with 500 people, where there are no vegan alternatives to buy, where your diet is genuinely deficient, where it would be very easy to make excuses to eat meat, to eat dairy, to not be vegan, where you're maybe surrounded more directly impacted by the culture of meat, the culture of dairy, in terms of local farms that could be in the area. And this is something that the vegan community often doesn't talk about. The vegan community likes to portray veganism as something that's easy, happy, healthy. And in some cases it can be, but in some cases it isn't. In some cases it is generally hard. In some cases it does cause general suffering, whether that be social suffering, whether that be the anguish of the person themselves, come to terms with their own morality, or the general suffering of having a bad diet, having a poor diet, having a diet that's deficient, which could cause not only physical but and possibly even mental impairment. And I think it will be far better for the vegan community not to lie, not to paint a broad brush in terms of veganism, not to sugarcoat things, but instead point out veganism is something that does cause suffering, something that is generally hard, something that does cause hardship, or at least can in some circumstances. But on top of that, point out it's meaningful suffering. It's something that you should do, it's something that you should take up. It's something that for a lot of people isn't going to be easy, that is going to be hard in terms of one reason or other, but rather a meaningful sacrifice that you should make. Because this is the point I want to make out in the video. Despite, say, whether it be something as simple as veganism, it's donating money, or something that is generally more perilous, such as doing mission work, well, this does cause a lot of hardship, a lot of suffering. It's meaningful suffering, it's meaningful hardship. And I think that there would be a certain contentment that would come through in this. Which is to say, despite the suffering, despite the hardship, in the end it would be worth it. In the end, that is the only path to being a good person. Because if doing something good is easy, if donating money is easy, if being vegan is easy, if donating to good causes is easy, anyone can do it. There is no distinction between the good person who makes general sacrifices and the person who's donating, say, £1 in the charity box, the person who becomes vegetarian rather than vegan, the person who, rather than getting himself mixed up in general mission work, simply supports the cause on Twitter. To be a good person, you do have to put yourself through some suffering. Doesn't necessarily have to be extreme suffering. Again, you don't have to join a mission. But I think it's very important to make the distinction between the good act, which can come either through suffering or through ease, and the good person that makes general sacrifices, that puts themselves in front of suffering, in front of hardship, to do those good actions, that really challenges themselves, that pushes themselves to the absolute limit to be a good person rather than just doing what is easy.